The heavy, humid air of late spring settles softly over the landscape, carrying the rich, distinct scent of damp earth and distant impending rain. If we close our eyes for just a single moment, we can hear the low, rhythmic hum of the modern world vibrating outside the walls of our immediate sanctuary. We hear the distant, continuous drone of highway traffic, the sharp, relentless pings of digital notifications cutting through our thoughts, and the collective, rushed breathing of a society that is constantly running toward an invisible finish line. We live in an era of unprecedented global connectivity, a time when we can peer into the lives of individuals halfway across the planet with a single swipe of a finger, yet we feel deeply, profoundly fragmented within ourselves. Our attention is no longer a unified stream, it is fractured into 1,000 tiny shards, pulled continuously by the gravity of what we must achieve next, what email we forgot to reply to, or how we are being perceived by an invisible, judgmental online audience. We sit in comfortable, climate-controlled rooms, surrounded by material conveniences that our ancestors could not have possibly dreamed of. Yet, our physical bodies carry the invisible weight of a phantom armor. We are perpetually bracing for a crisis that never quite arrives, but always feels terrifyingly imminent. Look closely at how we inhabit our own skin in this very moment, during the ordinary routines of our day. We walk down crowded city streets with our eyes glued to glowing handheld screens, completely missing the subtle shift of the wind through the trees, or the way the soft afternoon light catches the edge of an old brick wall. We sit in corporate meetings or stand in the lines of supermarkets with our shoulders subtly elevated, our chests tight, holding our breath as if waiting for an unannounced blow to fall from above. We have become extraordinary masters of survival, navigating complex social matrices and hyper-efficient workflows, but we have forgotten the simple, foundational art of being. This constant state of hypervigilance is not merely an abstract mental habit or a fleeting emotional mood. It is a dense physical reality that actively shapes our bones, tightens our muscles, and restricts the natural flow of our breath. We are caught in a continuous exhausting feedback loop where a deeply anxious mind creates a rigid, defensive body, and that tense body, in turn, constantly convinces the mind that it is under imminent siege. If we tune our awareness into the immediate space around us, the fragmentation becomes undeniably clear. Our minds operate like crowded airports, with thoughts arriving and departing on multiple runways simultaneously, leaving no space for the quiet stillness of empty tarmac. We listen to a friend speak, but even as their words hang in the air, a secondary dialogue is running wild in our heads, formatting our response, judging their intent, or wandering off to the tasks of tomorrow. This is the modern diaspora of consciousness. A state of being where our physical form is seated in a chair, while our mental energy is scattered across 5 different digital platforms, 3 past regrets, and a dozen future anxieties. We have fragmented our presence so thoroughly that the present moment feels like an inhospitable place, a mere stepping stone we must cross to get to a better, safer, or more successful version of ourselves. We treat time not as a continuous river to swim in, but as a series of scarce tokens we must hoard, spend, and optimize until we are entirely spent. This fragmentation manifests as a deep, underlying static in our daily experience, a low-frequency hum of dissatisfaction that persists even when things are going remarkably well. We achieve a long-sought-after goal, yet the joy lasts for a mere heartbeat before the mind immediately pivots to ask what the next milestone is. We experience a moment of quiet peace on a weekend, and instantly, a subtle anxiety creeps in, whispering that we are wasting time, that we are falling behind, that others are outperforming us while we sit idle. This is the invisible friction of modern existence, a quiet desperation born from the belief that our worth is entirely synonymous with our productivity. We have outsourced our internal sense of safety to external validations, leaving us completely vulnerable to the unpredictable shifts of circumstance, praise, and blame. Our energy is constantly projected outward, leaving the internal landscape dry, uncultivated, and foreign to our own awareness. Consider how we react when a rare moment of absolute silence presents itself to us. When the television is turned off, the smartphone battery dies, or the social gathering ends, a sudden, uncomfortable weight descends upon the room. In that stillness, the unresolved echoes of our lives begin to bubble up to the surface. We feel the hidden currents of loneliness, the unexamined grief of past losses, and the deep-seated fear of our own insignificance. Because we do not know how to sit with these raw textures of human experience, we immediately reach for a distraction. We turn on the radio, open a new browser tab, or compulsively check our messages, doing anything we can to drown out the quiet voice of our own vulnerability. We treat our own inner life as a hostile territory that must be avoided, subdued, or heavily medicated with constant activity and consumption. This avoidance creates an unspoken alienation from our own biology. We treat our physical body not as a living, sensing house of awareness, but as a complex machine that we merely manipulate to transport our thinking heads from one meeting to the next. We push past its clear signals of exhaustion with caffeine. We ignore its digestive distress with processed convenience. And we silence its cries for movement by sitting for hours at desks under harsh fluorescent lights. We have broken the sacred covenant between mind and body, forgetting that every unresolved emotion, every suppressed trauma, and every unexpressed boundary does not simply vanish into thin air. It deposits itself deep within our physical tissues, waiting to be acknowledged. We are a generation of divided selves, living entirely from the neck up, steering a numb and burdened vehicle through a world of hyperstimulation. The collective consequence of this division is a pervasive, modern burnout that cannot be cured by a simple vacation or a weekend at a spa. It is the exhaustion of the soul, a deep-seated weariness that arises when we spend our entire lives performing a role that does not align with our baseline reality. We wear masks of absolute competence, emotional stability, and endless enthusiasm, while underneath the surface, the foundations are quietly crumbling. We look around at our peers and assume they have it all figured out, completely unaware that they are playing the exact same game of hidden exhaustion, looking back at us with the same envy and secret despair. We are all participating in a grand, unwritten agreement to pretend that this hyper-accelerated, disconnected mode of living is normal, healthy, and sustainable, even as our bodies and minds break down under the immense strain. To understand the root of this collective exhaustion, we must be willing to stop running, if only for the duration of this shared reflection. We must dare to step off the treadmill of constant optimization and bring our attention all the way down into the immediate, visceral reality of the flesh. We need to feel the precise points where our feet meet the floor, the rise and fall of our rib cage with each breath, and the subtle, vibrating current of energy that runs through our hands. This simple act of turning the awareness inward is a radical countercultural movement. It is the beginning of reclaiming our undivided mind from the external forces that seek to capitalize on our distraction. It is the moment we stop being passive consumers of our own lives and become active, deeply embodied witnesses to the truth of our present experience, ready to investigate the profound illusions that have kept us bound to the wheel of perpetual striving. The concrete structure of this societal treadmill becomes visible when we observe the individuals who navigate its upper corridors with flawless precision. Let us look closely at a figure who exemplifies our modern struggle, a person we can recognize in our colleagues, our leaders, and very often, in the reflection we meet in the mirror each morning. We can call this archetype the architect of shadows. On the surface, their life is an enviable masterpiece of strategic planning, continuous advancement, and curated excellence. They possess the prestigious corporate title, the impeccably designed living space, the high-performance fitness routine, and the social circle that reinforces their status. They are celebrated by their peers as a paragon of reliability, a human engine capable of absorbing endless amounts of pressure without ever showing a sign of strain. But if we pull back the polished exterior and look beneath the surface of this presentation, we discover a profound and quiet erosion of the living organism. Notice the physical manifestation of this relentless striving as it writes its story directly into their anatomy. When the architect of shadows sits at their desk, their body is not at rest, it is in a state of suspended combat. Their jaw is perpetually clenched, the masseter muscles along the side of the face standing out like tight cords of wire. This chronic tension is not accidental. It is the physical graveyard of unexpressed frustrations, boundary violations that were never spoken aloud, and a deep-seated fear of being exposed as inadequate. Even in the deepest hours of the night, when the mind is supposedly asleep, the teeth grind against one another, physically wearing away their own substance, a silent testament to an internal war that never takes a holiday. Move your awareness down into their shoulders and the base of their skull, where the suboccipital muscles are contracted into the density of stone. This is the structural armor of future security. It is the physical weight of carrying a 5-year plan, a quarterly projection, and an existential dread of professional obsolescence. Their shoulders are subtly, chronically elevated toward their ears, a biological reflex designed to protect the vulnerable carotid arteries from a predator that no longer hunts in the forest, but now lives within the email inbox. When we live this way, our chest becomes a rigid vault. The ribs lose their natural elasticity, and the breathing is forced to become shallow, rapid, and restricted entirely to the upper lobes of the lungs. This shallow, thoracic breathing acts as a continuous chemical signal to the ancient survival centers of our brain, whispering that we are being pursued, that resources are scarce, and that we must never, under any circumstance, lower our guard. This bodily constriction is the physical autobiography of our modern anxiety. It is the precise record of every emotion we have deemed too inconvenient or dangerous to feel in the moment. When a wave of genuine grief, exhaustion, or self-doubt arises within the architect of shadows, they do not have the luxury of time or space to process it. The demanding schedule requires them to smile, to present, to execute. Therefore, the emotion is suppressed, pushed down out of conscious awareness, and exiled into the tissues of the body. The stomach tightens into a hard knot. The intestines absorb the metabolic shock of unexamined panic, and the throat constricts to hold back the tears that might compromise their professional armor. We treat these physical symptoms not as profound messages from a suffering intelligence, but as mechanical failures to be corrected with substances. We use caffeine to force our exhausted nervous systems into compliance in the morning, and we use sedative or alcohol to chemically blunt our hyperarousal at night. The great tragedy of this lifestyle is the trap of compensatory striving. When the architect of shadows begins to feel the underlying ache of emptiness and physical depletion, their habitual response is to do more of what caused the injury in the first place. They assume that their discomfort is a sign of personal inefficiency, a metric that needs to be optimized through better time management, a cleaner diet, or an even more rigorous exercise regimen. They download applications to track their sleep. They wear devices that measure their heart rate variability, and they turn their very wellness into another competitive arena. They try to solve an existential crisis of exhaustion with advanced productivity tools, treating themselves like a machine that simply requires a more sophisticated software update. But the underlying engine cannot be tricked by statistics. The more they build, the more they have to protect, and the circle of vigilance expands until the body becomes a prison of its own making. When failure or criticism inevitably arrives in this hypervigilant state, because life is entirely indifferent to our carefully constructed timelines, the internal collapse is catastrophic. A missed promotion, a ruptured relationship, or a sudden health crisis does not just feel like a temporary setback, it feels like an existential execution. Because the architect of shadows has fused their entire identity with their external performance, any crack in the performance threatens to dissolve their entire sense of self. The mind turns upon itself with a ferocious, predatory intensity that is far more damaging than the external event that triggered it. We begin to live in a state of constant anticipation, scanning every horizon for potential threats, transforming our daily interactions into tactical maneuvers where everyone is a potential competitor and every situation is a test we must pass. This continuous projection of awareness into the future leaves the immediate present completely desolate. We walk through magnificent parks, our bodies moving through fresh air and vibrant greenery, while our minds are trapped in a dark room, rehearsing a difficult conversation that might happen 3 weeks from now. We sit across the dinner table from the people we claim to love most in the world, yet we do not see the texture of their skin, we do not hear the true cadence of their voice, because our internal landscape is preoccupied with a digital matrix of numbers, deadlines, and social comparisons. We have become ghosts inhabiting our own lives, spectral entities that hover above our actual experience, always looking toward the next horizon, always waiting for the real life to begin once the current project is finally completed. We must ask ourselves, as we look at this pattern within our own lives, what is the currency we are using to pay for this relentless optimization? We are paying with the raw material of our existence. We are trading our limited breath, our capacity for genuine intimacy, our somatic peace, and our capacity for joy, all in exchange for an illusion of security that can be wiped out in a single moment by an economic shift, a medical diagnosis, or a sudden change of heart in another person. We are running so fast to avoid our vulnerability that we are running past our lives entirely. The physical body, in its infinite wisdom, continues to send us warning lights: the tension headache, the chronic insomnia, the systemic inflammation, the sudden panic attack, not to punish us, but to beg us, to look down at the ground we are standing on, to drop the invisible weapons we are holding, and to question the foundational myths upon which we have built our modern identity. When we examine this internal breakdown, we begin to discover that the collapse is never truly caused by the external storm itself, but by the structural vulnerability of the house we have built. This is the moment where our modern psychological framework must meet the piercing diagnostics of an ancient evolutionary blueprint. To understand why the architect of shadows crumbles under the weight of a missed promotion or a fractured relationship, we have to look directly at the universal law of friction that governs all of conditional reality. In our contemporary vocabulary, we often speak of stress, trauma, or burnout as if they are modern inventions, unique anomalies of the 21st century that can be engineered away with a better lifestyle design. But if we peel back the layers of our sophisticated terminology, we find ourselves staring at the very same foundational truth identified 26 centuries ago under the shade of a widespread tree: the inherent, unavoidable friction of an impermanent existence. Life, by its very nature, is a continuous sequence of collisions between our internal expectations and the external universe. We encounter physical decay, the sudden dissolution of our secure structures, the betrayal of our expectations, and the ultimate certainty of our own mortality. This is the first collision, a primary friction that is woven into the very fabric of biological life. No amount of wealth, no level of professional optimization, and no degree of hypervigilance can ever protect us from this primary impact. It is the absolute baseline of our reality, Yet, when this primary friction strikes the modern overachiever, we do not simply experience the raw, clean pain of the impact. Instead, an instantaneous, lightning-fast psychological architecture activates within our minds, picking up a secondary weapon and driving it deep into our own open wound. This secondary self-inflicted strike is what ancient wisdom defines as the second arrow. If you are walking through an open field and an arrow flies out of the brush, piercing your shoulder, you experience a profound wave of physical pain. The flesh is torn, the blood flows, and the nervous system screams with an intense biological alarm. This is the first arrow, representing the unavoidable, painful occurrences of our human journey. It is a sudden corporate downsizing, a cold rejection from a life partner, or the natural decline of our physical health. But what does the modern mind do immediately after being struck by this first arrow? We do not sit down to tend to the wound. We do not apply the soothing compress of gentle attention to the torn skin. Instead, we furiously grab a second arrow, aim it at the exact same spot, and pierce ourselves again with our own hands. This second arrow is our elaborate cognitive reaction to the primary pain. It is the cascading torrent of commentary, judgment, blame, and catastrophic storytelling that erupts within our awareness the moment something goes wrong. When the first arrow lands, the mind immediately begins to scream its furious resistance. We tell ourselves that this should not be happening to us, that we must have committed a fatal error to deserve this outcome, or that our entire future is now permanently ruined. We spend hours, days, and sometimes entire decades dissecting the trajectory of the first arrow, building a massive monument of resentment around it. We demand to know why the world is so unfair, why our colleagues are succeeding while we suffer, and how we manage to let our defenses fail so spectacularly. This internal cross-examination is far more destructive than the original event, turning a temporary setback into a chronic state of existential suffering. If we look closely at the mechanism of this self-inflicted violence, we can observe its devastating metabolic cost. The physical body, with all its biological brilliance, is incapable of distinguishing between a real, external physical threat and a vivid, terrifying nightmare engineered by our own thoughts. When the architect of shadows lies awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, mentally rehearsing a difficult confrontation or obsessing over a perceived failure, their liver releases glucose into the bloodstream, their heart pumps with frantic energy, and their adrenal glands flood their tissues with stress hormones. There is no actual physical danger present in the quiet darkness of their bedroom. The room is warm, the bed is soft, and the air is safe. Yet, their physical body is being systematically poisoned by the second arrow of their own narrative. We are essentially drowning in the chemical secretions of our own unexamined stories, burning through our vital reserves of life energy to fight monsters that exist nowhere outside the boundary of our own imagination. To dismantle this engine of suffering, we must push our investigation deeper, past the superficial symptoms of our anxiety, and look directly into the core illusion that fuels the second arrow. At the very center of our modern exhaustion lies a deeply ingrained, unquestioned assumption, the belief that there is a solid, static, monumental entity called the self that must be continually defended, polished, and preserved against the world. We view our identity as if it were a grand marble statue erected in a public square. We believe that this statue must remain perfectly pristine, unblemished by criticism, untouched by failure, and completely immune to the weathering effects of time. Every negative piece of feedback, every professional misstep, and every natural sign of aging feels like a violent chip taken off our substance, a threatening reduction of our very being. This illusion of a monolithic, independent self is the ultimate source of our collective hypervigilance. Because we believe we are fragile, isolated monuments standing against a chaotic environment, We are forced to spend our entire lives acting as security guards for our own identity. We have to monitor how the statue is being viewed. We have to build elaborate fences around it in the form of status symbols and achievements. And we must constantly patch up the cracks with a forced performance of absolute competence. But if we adopt the sharp, uncompromising lens of ultimate reality, we discover that this solid statue is a complete fiction of the mind. There is no unchanging monumental self to be found anywhere within this physical and mental architecture. When we examine our actual immediate experience, what do we find? We do not find a solid stone statue, we find a fluid, constantly moving river of interrelated processes. The physical body we inhabit is not a static object, it is a continuous dynamic exchange with the entire planet. The air we breathe in this very second was once the atmosphere of distant oceans, the water moving through our veins was once rain falling on far-off mountains. The cells of our organs are constantly dying, dissolving, and being remade from the nutrients of the earth. We are not separate from nature. We are an expression of nature happening right here in this chair. Our thoughts, our moods, our anxieties, and our triumphs are not permanent fixtures of a solid self. They are passing currents of energy, rising and falling according to a vast web of conditions, like waves moving across the surface of an open sea. When we cling to the illusion of a rigid identity, we place ourselves in a state of perpetual, unwinnable warfare against the fundamental law of impermanence. We want our professional status to remain frozen in an upward trajectory. We want our bodies to remain permanently young and energetic, and we want our emotional states to remain beautifully stable and pleasant. But the universe does not accommodate our desire for stasis. Everything is moving, changing, and sliding into new forms. When we try to build a rigid dam across this river of change, the water inevitably pools behind our barrier, building up an immense, terrifying structural pressure until it finally breaks through, causing widespread internal devastation. Our anxiety is nothing more than the psychic tension of trying to hold back the flow of time with our bare hands. The shift into true internal liberation begins when we finally dare to drop the heavy chisel of self-carving. We stop trying to sculpt ourselves into a permanent, flawless monument for the world to admire. We begin to understand that when there is no static defensive ego to protect, the second arrow has absolutely nowhere to land. It cannot pierce a shadow, it cannot wound a river. When a difficult event occurs, when the first arrow strikes our life, we can feel the clean, natural sorrow of the loss, without adding the toxic poison of self-blame and existential panic. The criticism of others passes directly through our open awareness, like wind moving through an empty room, leaving the sky of our consciousness completely unblemished and whole. We no longer need to exhaust ourselves, playing the role of the security guard. We can finally step out of the armor and allow ourselves to be continuous with the unfolding reality of the present moment. To begin dismantling this cage of our own construction, we must introduce a radically different way of interacting with our internal landscape, moving entirely away from analytical thinking and into the raw realm of visceral embodied presence. The intellect, which has been our primary tool for navigating the external corporate world, is fundamentally unequipped to heal the wounds of our nervous system. We cannot think our way out of a problem that was created by overthinking. Instead, we must explore a profound operational framework that we can call the loom of untamed threads. Imagine your mind and body as a vast ancient textile loom, and every thought, emotion, and bodily sensation as a colorful thread passing continuously through the wooden shuttle. For decades, through our frantic lifestyle of achievement and defense, we have been weaving a tapestry of severe tension, knotting the threads of fear, ambition, and suppressed grief so tightly together that the resulting fabric has become stiff, heavy, and completely unyielding. The practice of somatic transformation is not about destroying this ancient loom, nor is it about desperately throwing away the threads we dislike. Rather, it is about learning the precise art of weaving with a loose, spacious hand, allowing the threads to move freely through the mechanism without binding or jamming the gears. This internal architecture begins with a deliberate shift in our locus of attention, moving from the conceptual realm down into what can be described as systematic somatic tracking. When a sudden wave of workplace anxiety, interpersonal irritation, or existential dread hits us during the day, our habitual response is to immediately look upward into the mind, building an elaborate cognitive story around the discomfort. We point fingers outward, we analyze the past, and we construct terrifying future projections to justify the panic we feel. To break this cycle, we must implement a rigorous discipline of bypassing the mental narrative entirely, choosing instead to drop our attention directly into the dense, dark physical landscape of the torso. We look inward with fierce curiosity and ask ourselves a very specific question. Where is this emotion living in my physical flesh at this exact microsecond? We must learn to locate the precise coordinates of our suffering within the biological body. Is it a hot, heavy weight pressing down on the center of the chest? Is it a cold, sharp contraction narrowing the throat? Is it a dull, twisting ache deep within the intestines, or a sudden, rigid binding of the diaphragm that completely cuts off the breath? We must describe these sensations to ourselves using exclusively physical characteristics, measuring temperature, density, pressure, vibration, and movement, completely stripping the experience of its psychological labels. By reducing a massive, terrifying mental crisis to a localized pattern of physical pressure, we immediately strip the emotion of its narrative power, transforming a catastrophic existential threat into what it actually is: a temporary, manageable configuration of energy moving through our physiology. Once we have successfully mapped the physical location of the distress, we must apply the foundational principle of radical non-resistance, which completely alters our biochemical response to pain. In our ordinary way of living, the moment the mind detects a pocket of physical tension or emotional discomfort, it immediately recoils in disgust, treating the sensation as an enemy alien that must be aggressively conquered, suppressed, or driven away. This internal resistance is the very hand that fires the second arrow, creating a secondary layer of friction that locks the original tension permanently into our muscle fibers. In this new practice, however, we do exactly the opposite of what our defensive ego demands. We consciously direct our inhalation right into the absolute epicenter of the physical tightness, utilizing the breath not as a weapon to force the discomfort to leave, but as a spacious, gentle container to hold it exactly as it is. Within the quiet sanctuary of our own heart, we look directly at the burning chest, the knotted stomach, or the constricted throat, and we whisper a silent phrase of absolute hospitality. I see you, I feel you, and you are entirely welcome to be here for as long as you need. This is the precise psychological moment where the second arrow is broken into pieces and dropped to the earth. The ego desperately wants to fight the discomfort, which only serves to generate more cortisol and tighten the armor by offering absolutely zero resistance. By opening the doors of our house wide to the unwanted guest, the dense energy of the stored emotion begins to lose its rigidity. Just as a tightly wound, chaotic ball of yarn naturally begins to unspool and relax when it is simply left alone on an open table, the ancient trauma stored within our deep muscular networks begins to soften the moment it is met with a completely non-judgmental, spacious awareness. As this softening slowly unfolds across our physical frame, we begin to cultivate the secondary phase of this mental training, which can be understood as the practice of unbounded witnessing. In our standard state of modern fragmentation, we are completely fused with the contents of our consciousness. When a thought of failure arises, We become the failure, and when a sensation of panic grips the chest, we become the panic, swept away by the turbulent current of the river. Through systematic somatic tracking, we begin to create a beautiful microscopic distance between the observer and the observed. We sit completely still in the midst of the internal storm, watching the waves of heat, pressure, and fear rise up through our flesh, peak in intensity, and naturally dissolve back into stillness, without us ever needing to intervene, fix, or react to their presence. We start to realize a profound truth that changes our entire relationship to reality. We are not the passing cloud of anxiety, we are the vast, untroubled sky that allows the cloud to exist. We are not the painful knot in the stomach, we are the deep, ocean-like awareness that encompasses and knows the knot. This realization marks the total reclamation of our internal sovereignty, shifting our identity away from the fragile, temporary contents of our experience and anchoring it firmly in the unshakable context of awareness itself. We become like a magnificent mountain that remains completely indifferent to the weather patterns rolling across its peaks, whether it is wrapped in the golden light of a summer sun or battered by the freezing winds of a winter blizzard. The mountain remains fundamentally unmoved, rooted deep in the baseline reality of the earth. To integrate this profound shift into the chaotic rhythm of our professional and personal lives, we must establish a daily ritual of conscious pause, creating small, non-negotiable clearings of silence within our hyper-scheduled environments. We do not need to retreat to a distant monastery or sit on a cushion for hours to practice this. We can practice it in the brief intervals between corporate meetings, while standing in the crowded elevator, or right before we open our laptops to begin the day's work. In those transitional moments, we deliberately close our eyes for 60 seconds, drop our jaw to release the masseter muscles, allow our shoulders to drop down to their natural relaxed position, and invite the breath to sink deep into the lowest quadrants of the abdomen. We feel the raw texture of the current moment without looking at a screen, without checking a metric, and without planning the next sentence. We treat these brief pauses as a vital metabolic recalibration, an intentional interruption of the sympathetic nervous system's survival loop, showing our body that it is safe to step out of the phantom armor and rest in the immediate present. This is not a practice of passive escape. It is the cultivation of a fierce, elegant internal discipline that allows us to engage with the complex demands of the modern world from a position of absolute alignment and fullness, rather than a place of desperate deficit and fear. Through the continuous application of this somatic discipline, the very structure of our daily actions begins to transform, moving away from the frantic, jagged movements of a panicked animal and into the smooth, efficient flow of an integrated being. We find that we can answer a demanding email without our shoulders rising to our ears. We can receive a piece of harsh criticism without our jaw locking into stone. We can experience an unexpected financial setback without our mind launching into a catastrophic narrative of total ruin. We become capable of meeting the inevitable friction of biological life with a spacious, relaxed grace, handling the first arrows with immense tenderness while refusing to fabricate the second. The ancient loom of our mind begins to weave a completely new tapestry that is light, flexible, and strong enough to withstand the changing winds of fortune without ever tearing at the seams. We stop acting as the frantic, exhausted performers on a public stage, constantly begging for the applause of an audience that is just as frightened as we are. We step back into the deep shadows of the theater, resting comfortably as the silent, luminous witness to the entire play of existence, fully prepared to step into the ultimate state of undisturbed peace. As these dense, restrictive somatic knots continuously dissolve under the steady warmth of our undivided attention, we witness a profound and quiet revolution unfolding within the interior architecture of our biological form. The physical body, which had for decades functioned as a heavily fortified border wall, begins to remember its original nature as an open, fluid, and brilliantly cooperative ecosystem. Notice the immediate visceral qualities of this profound return to our baseline reality. The long-suffering muscles of the jaw and face surrender their tight, defensive grip, smoothing out the invisible lines of chronic worry and exhausting performance. The shoulders naturally descend to their proper biological resting place, completely releasing the phantom weight of unborn tomorrows and unvouched-for legacies. The protective cage of the ribcage expands in all directions, allowing the inhalation to plunge deeply and effortlessly into the soft, unmapped terrain of the lower abdomen, establishing a solid, grounding anchor in the physical safety of the immediate present. In this luminous space of complete non-resistance, we enter into a state of consciousness characterized by an unshakable, transparent stability. We are no longer frantically fighting against the tides of existence, nor are we drowning beneath their surface. Instead, we have become the very ocean itself, intimately containing every wave of experience without ever losing our foundational depth. The praise and blame of our social professional circles, the unpredictable gains and losses of our material pursuits, and the natural, inevitable decay of our physical forms are now witnessed with a calm, smiling equanimity. They are recognized simply as the passing, weather-like variations of a conditional world, incapable of scratching or diminishing the vast, empty sky of our true awareness. We have finally discovered the internal sovereign sanctuary that cannot be granted by public applause, cannot be stolen by corporate disruption, and cannot be compromised by the unceasing river of historical time. Resting deeply in this unblemished transparency, we can hear the timeless resonance of the ultimate words spoken by the awakened teacher as he prepared to dissolve his own physical form into the absolute. Standing on the edge of the great transition, surrounded by those who wept for the loss of his external guidance, he did not command them to construct elaborate monuments, nor did he instruct them to lean upon his historical memory for salvation. He looked upon their grieving forms with an immense, boundless tenderness and delivered his final roaring testament to human capability. Be lamps unto yourselves, hold fast to the truth as your only refuge. Look not for assistance to anyone outside of your own nature. Decay is completely inherent in all compounded things, but the unpolished truth of awareness remains untouched forever. Work out your own liberation with fierce, uncompromised diligence. This is the ultimate, non-negotiable call to absolute internal self-reliance and spiritual sovereignty. It is a radical reminder that the keys to our healing, the map to our waking up, and the power to completely shatter the cycle of self-inflicted suffering do not belong to any external deity, any charismatic guru, or any complex, over-engineered lifestyle metric. They reside entirely within the immediate available scope of your very next breath and the honest, visceral tracking of your own flesh. The pristine light of liberation is not a distant, exhausting peak that we must summit through decades of painful striving. It is the fundamental, birthright baseline of our being that is immediately revealed the absolute moment we choose to drop our heavy weapons, step out of our phantom armor, and stop running away from the reality of who we already are. As we now prepare to transition back into the accelerating rhythms, demands, and relational matrices of our contemporary daily lives, let us make a sacred covenant to carry this spacious, undivided awareness with us into every room we inhabit. When the digital notifications begin to fracture our attention once more, when the competitive pressures of our industries demand that we put on the old, exhausting mask of absolute competence, or when an unexpected personal crisis threatens to shatter our carefully laid plans, Let us remember to pause for the brief duration of a single conscious breath. Let us consciously drop the jaw, open the hand, and feel the raw, vibrating current of life moving through our immediate anatomy, refusing to allow our minds to flee into the dark corridors of catastrophic storytelling. As we sit here together in the fading echo of this shared reflection, feeling the cool air entering our nostrils and the steady, reliable support of the earth beneath our bodies, let us bring this entire journey down into a single piercing inquiry that we can carry into the silent spaces of our own heart. Let us look closely at the choices we are making in the hidden laboratory of our private thoughts and ask ourselves, in this very moment, as the unpredictable events of life unfold around us, are we merely tending to the clean, unavoidable pain of the first arrow, or are our own hands actively, silently forging the second?